So it's a weird issue.
Ladies, gentlemen, and those with the good sense to do away with the whole notion, I welcome you to the premier audio medium for all your Fazbear entertainment needs. The Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. Note, FFPP is not responsible for any loss of appetite, disinterest, dismemberment, or other legally classified statuses. So strap in and enjoy.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. I'm the host of the Toast, Rye Toast, here to talk to you about Five Nights at Freddy's like we always do. We are still very deep in Secret of the Mimic. I think we're going to be, like I've been saying, for at least a month about the game itself, but I kind of wanted to take a slight break from the game itself and focus more on what this game says about the rest of the franchise, because that's something that I haven't had a lot of time to touch on yet, because obviously there's so much in the game itself that I'm so focused on the game itself that I haven't really talked about its wider repercussions. And I kind of wanted to delve into that a bit today, just to give our brains a little bit of a break on just Secret of the Mimic and talk more about its ripples throughout the timeline. So I think the easiest way to go about that is to start with the endings and what those endings say about the games that it connects to. Because obviously this game is primarily about the Mimic, the current antagonist of the FNAF timeline. But it's kind of telling us that the Mimic isn't just an endoskeleton. It is a program, an endoskeleton with a separate iterated program within it. You know, it tells us how many different variants there are of the Mimic, and I think we would be remiss to not talk about how that splits. Now, this isn't news if you've been reading the books. I feel like Secret of the Mimic was really instrumental in doing two things. First of all, you know, it opened up a lot of the book lore to the main fandom. The idea that the Mimic is an endoskeleton with a specific program within it. But the second thing it did is also shake the fandom and be like, even though this is the book lore we are incorporating into the games are not the books. These are two separate narratives. And I think that's pretty definitive. Now, as far as what that means for the grander timeline, I don't think that means we throw out the entirety of the books, right? Some people have been saying, okay, well, Tales games has been disproven, so don't look to Tales for any information. I think that is, I think that's a little too black and white. It's a little too cut and dry. I would say Tales is still incredibly useful for additional lore we don't have game information on, kind of like it always has been. I said going into this game that I treat the Tales games as stopgaps for the information we don't have from the games themselves, and I still think that's fairly true. At least it's good to help patchwork your theories and timelines of the games with the books, right? The books and the games aren't one-to-one. They don't say the same things, but it is still useful. For example, Gregory, right? We don't know what he was doing before Security Breach. As far as we're aware, in the game's timeline, he apparated at the beginning of Security Breach. Meanwhile, we have Escape the Pizzaplex, a interactive novel that shows Gregory and Cassie playing weeks before Security Breach, Gregory tormenting Cassie, and that kind of shows that maybe Gregory was under the influence of Glitchtrap at that time, and that doubles down with a story like GGY, which, yes, is in Tales from the Pizzaplex, but again, I think these stories are useful and relevant to the lore, even if they're not one-to-one, and they don't directly take place. The fact that we get an entire short story dedicated about Gregory being a servant to Glitchtrap, I think is incredibly useful. Think about the story The Mimic in general, right? We have this entire story of The Mimic, where it's telling us, like, hey, Edwin Murray made a robot called the Mimic to watch over his son, and after his son died, he beat it, and that's the thing that turns into our villain. That's still pretty true, right? Like, a lot of the details are different. A lot of the information is different, and a lot of this isn't lining up. So the stories are not one-to-one with the games. They are not within the same timeline, but the general themes are. And I think, like the Silver Eyes, like Fazbear Frights, I'm going to be taking Tales of the Pizzaplex and looking at its general themes, its vague overstatements, and incorporating them into theories. Now, what about the interactive novels? Unfortunately, I think those are probably a case-by-case basis, because, you know, the week before slots pretty perfectly into the FNAF timeline with very, very little continuity issues, and tells us a lot about FNAF 1. Escape the Pizzaplex. Same thing with Security Breach. It actually says so little about the grander timeline that it can't really mess with anything. But then we get something like Return to the Pit, which, on one hand, if you go through the main story, is different than the Into the Pit story and different than the Into the Pit Mega Cat Studios game, but is similar enough that it could be like, okay, maybe this is the books telling us that Into the Pit happened. But there are other plot lines in that interactive novel that are so incredibly different from the main story that it's like, okay, well, is it? You know, the idea that there's a Avengers team of adults who were kids and scared by the yellow rabbit apparition of agony from this ball pit who get together and storm the restaurant to try to kill it with guns. Like, that's an insane subplot. And, you know, it didn't happen. You know, the Return to the Pit canon ending is fairly similar to the Into the Pit ending in both the book and the games. But it's this, if we are to take these books as face value, as like, oh, all the interactive novels are fully within the games, then we're looking at this is a possible thing that's happening. Like, there is this group of adults, whether or not they got to storm the restaurant, they were getting ready to and were planning to, right? So that is just an insane detail that this book presents. So I believe, at least, Return to the Pit, likely not canon to the main story, and not in the same continuity, rather. But then we look at something like VIP. And VIP is kind of like what a lot of people were hoping Escape the Pizzaplex would be, where even though VIP is a fraction of the length of any of the other interactive novels, it tells us a lot more about how Security Breach and the Mega Pizzaplex was forming. You know, Escape the Pizzaplex told us very, very, very little about why Security Breach happened, whereas VIP fairly directly shows us a possibility of how it came to be. The idea that the Mimic program was uploaded to this old technology and slowly crept throughout the entire Pizzaplex. Like, that seems fairly likely and connected to how Security Breach happened. The idea of Glitch Trap, or an iteration of the Mimic, which we will get to, being uploaded to the Pizzaplex and slowly creeping through all the technology. And then we get Escape the Pizzaplex, which is just kind of Gregory being an asshole for 200 pages, you know? And this isn't a knock on the quality, right? Most of these books are very well written. The short stories have high quality control to them. But it's just a matter of, as far as lore that's being presented, the interactive novels are kind of a mixed bag. So I would still, like, interactive novels, I want to say that, you know, The Week Before and Escape the Pizzaplex are probably fairly one-to-one, if not directly. But most other books in this series I would take with a grain of salt. And like, okay, here's some overarching themes, whether or not this directly happened. So to loop back to Secret of the Mimic, the reason we're here today, what is this game telling us about the timeline and about how the books are affecting that timeline? Well, check number one, right? We just discussed, I think Secret of the Mimic is telling us to not take the books as one-to-one, but rather these overarching narratives that can help color the missing spots in our timelines. So that being said, how does Secret of the Mimic, a game, affect the rest of the game timeline? And that comes down to the endings and what those endings mean. Because, you know, we learn a lot about the business side of things, the animatronic design side of things, and that has ripples in the early timeline. But as far as how this game connects to the current FNAF games coming out, that pretty much exclusively has to do with our endings and what those endings mean. Now, full disclosure, this week on the channel, I'm going to be doing a video about all three endings and what I think they are telling us. But I'm going to be going over the basic idea of it in this podcast to be able to talk about the endings themselves and what that might mean and how they connect. Because we have three main endings in this game, right? Once you have the original M2 blueprint on your data diver, you're able to either turn it over to Dispatch, or as we later find out, Fiona. You're able to, and then you leave, you know, which, if you do that, the Mimic sneaks into your van, seemingly kills you, stuffs you into the Freddy suit, or some people say it's the Springlock Fredbear suit, it's hard to tell, and you do a performance on stage very similar to the ending of Help Wanted 1. Then you have the choice of not turning over the data diver and instead delving deeper down, in which you find out that Dispatch was actually Fiona this whole time, or M1, and that all she wants is Edwin to fix M2 with the blueprints you've just collected in your data diver. So we we best Fiona in that underground pizzeria, and we agree, okay, we will go get Edwin and he will fix it. Once we get into Edwin's office, we find out that dude is long dead. So we execute something called cradle.exe and escape the facility. But we don't make it very far. We're driving away, and those little miniature robot creatures are crawling all over the van. They're making a swerve, and then eventually the Mimic joins them, punches through our windshield. We crash. It comes over, takes just our data diver's storage bank, not even the wrench, doesn't like attack us, just takes the storage bank, puts it on his chest, and huddles, waddles away. And then we have the third ending. Now, this is the one that takes the most effort to get. It's also the one that's the least likely to be canon, but it's the one where on your New Game Plus, you receive the White Tiger plushie, and if you play through the game, get every single collectible, and beat the moon.exe program, Sun herself appears, gives you the glitched permission, and then you can use that to access locked doors in the manor to rebuild the storytime tape system and tell it to M2 to confuse it and stun its programming enough to make it vulnerable, so you can just upload the original M2 blueprints directly, which then resets the Mimic, turning him back into a David copy, to which he takes the White Tiger plushie and goes to bed. This is probably the best ending for Arnold, because he doesn't go through a car crash or gets killed. I don't know what he does after this, but I hope he just takes his stuff and leaves. But then the question comes into, which one of these endings actually happened? And I think to figure that out, it's easiest if we break down what these endings are telling us. So starting with the third one, right, I kind of already went over it. This is the least likely to be canon option, because you can't technically actually do it without reloading the game and carrying over collectibles, so it doesn't quite work out. But putting that aside, because there have been canon endings that you need impossible items for, like in the week before, the only ending where we leave the FNAF 1 phone calls is one where we start the night with a phone of somebody who dies in our first playthrough. So, you physically cannot do that on your first playthrough, but that's still the canon ending, so it's not necessarily a hard deconfirmation of the ending. However, in this good ending, we reset the Mimic, we upload the M2 documents directly to it, and it's just this happy little robot child again. So assuming that worked, then this really can't be the true ending, because by the time of Ruin, M2 is a homicidal maniac trying to destroy anything it can see. And he's a sweet little baby the last time we left him, so either he's been messed with since then, or this is not the canon ending. Likely also is the idea that, if it's up there in the bedroom, something that needs to be answered with all of these endings is, how does it end up back in the basement? It's a huge question. How do you end up back in the basement? Maybe it's the lighting. I'm doing that thing again where I'm actually not that tired, right? I had my coffee, I had my gamer subs, which you can't do with code RITOS for 10% off, but I've had plenty of caffeine today. I actually had a decent amount of sleep, but something about it, it's so hard to keep my eyes open. I think it's just the lighting. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the heat too. Something about being warm makes me tired. I don't know what it is, but again, this office, not air conditioned. It's a basement, so it's a little cooler than you would expect, but it's 95 degrees outside. So I am sweating. It's why I'm recording in a black shirt, so you can't see the sweat pooling on my body. But because of that, I think that's part of the reason why I get so tired when I record these anymore. It's so hard to keep my eyes open. I am taking an active effort to keep my eyes open, to make eye contact with you, Devin. One of you is going to get freaked out by that. I always like doing that on stream. The idea of in the middle of a stream, we're playing Mario Kart. I'm like, we might get fifth. And then just to mess with people who are high while watching the stream, I'll be like, all right, we're coming up. We're almost there. Don't think about the bugs in your skin. We made it. Completely break character, down the barrel. It'd be really funny if one high person was like, what? I don't know. Is that cruel? I assume it's just a funny bit. I don't know. I got so off for ADHD be but for all those reasons, I don't think the third ending is possible. However, then we move on to the first two endings. There's the ending where we give the data driver to dispatch, or /Fiona, and there's the ending where we go deeper down and figure out what's truly going on in this facility. So on the first ending, we hand over the data diver, Fiona takes it and we leave, but the Mimic snuck on and took a ride, killing us, and then we are in a Showtime performance for the Mimic. So what's going on here? It's a little hard to parse, because thinking about the way the Mimic functions in this game, I'm not sure if M2 knows that our goal is the M2 blueprints to reset it. It's hard to say, because it does kind of seem like M2 just wants to kill any human it sees. But at the same time, I think part of M2 knows what the data diver is for. Because M2 seems to have created its own personality, which is why I think it's such an interesting antagonist. Right? M1/Fiona isn't at the same cognitive level as M2. Because M1/Fiona is a replication of one person, Fiona, Edwin's late wife. And while M1 is not Fiona, and, does not have the same personality, because over time, the nature of the robotics had it shift to a more cold and calculated idea of Fiona, it is still fully based off of Fiona and, not quite its own person. But then we look at M2, who was never really fully David, and now when we meet it, is not fully David, is not fully Edwin, is not fully any of the characters it exhibits, but is sort of a mixture of all of them. And is the idea that some of the documents in the game seem to say that M2 was going to eventually be sold as a product, which I think is, the game telling us that M2 wasn't at first one specific personality, but rather M2 was the idealized version of the Mimic that would be lucrative for Fazbear, an endoskeleton that can not only fit in any costume, but can contain multitudes of characters within itself and show off those characters at any time and become those characters at any time. So M2 wasn't necessarily directly built to be anything. It just takes on whatever it sees in its environment and replicates it, like the Mimic is meant to do. But interestingly enough, because of that, and because of everything it goes through, by the time of Secret of the Mimic, I would say that M2 is more of a person than M1, because it seems like, in being a copy of everything it's seen, M2 is actively choosing what parts of that to display at any given time, which to me says that it is becoming its own person, becoming like an intellectual, what is the word? Not autonomous, but the idea of being cognitively independent of a system. It seems like M2 is becoming that and actualizing itself and discovering its personality and using its data banks to represent it. I hate to make the reference 2 weeks in a row, but kind of like Bumblebee, from Michael Bay's Transformers, where Bumblebee had this personality, but it is choosing to display it with bits of radio because his voice box is broken. Now, Bumblebee isn't a mimic, right? But it's the idea of the mimic is repeating all of these lines in a very particular way, purposefully to speak its own mind, right? Do we think, legitimately, does anybody think that M2 thought Edwin was his son? No. I don't think that makes any sense. But still, when Edwin calls for help after beating M2, M2 responds with the sorry, buddy, daddy's a little busy right now, or whatever the line was. Which, is that saying that the mimic in that moment thinks it's Edwin and is talking to David? No. It's M2 using its already recorded data set to approximate the things it wants to say. AKA, Edwin's trapped under rubble and he's calling for help? No. I'm free now. I'm not serving you anymore. That is a direct line of defiance in his own voice back at him. I don't think that, that deep cut is on accident. So all this to say, it seems like, I don't know if M2 knows we're here to reset it to being David, but if it did, I'm damn sure it doesn't want to be. If M2 knew we could reset it into being David, I think it would try everything in its power to stop us. But I don't think it knows that's going to happen until maybe the end of the third ending. It seems to just kind of be a violent murderer. So then we look at its actions and how it works. And we look at the first ending, where even we finally sneak away, but somehow the mimic snuck into our van and, runs up behind us and directly hits us in the face, kills us, puts us into a suit. What does this ending mean? Well, I think this is the ending showing that M2 was hunting us, not the data diver. Because in this ending, we gave the data diver to M1/Fiona. We gave the data diver to Fiona, who Fiona's whole plan is I'll give the data diver to Edwin, he'll fix M2, and M2 will be David for me. So clearly something didn't work here. But even though we gave up that data diver, the mimic is still hunting us specifically and goes to kill us specifically, which tells me, at least in ending 1, I don't think it knows what the data diver is there for. I think it's just, trying to kill whoever it comes across because it's angry at the world. So then why are we in a performance at the end of the day? Well, I think M2 still sees the Murray's Costume Manor as its home. So I think it's returning there. It's got this new body, puts us into a suit. M1, however, has the data diver now. Now, M1, I don't think can physically control a lot of things. I think M1 is pretty confined to that MXES console and is relying on Edwin being able-bodied to repair M2 with the data diver. So if this is true, I think what we're seeing in the after credits of this first ending is that M1 is okay, I have the item that can fix M2. I just need to keep satiating him, keep him here while I go try to get Edwin to come over and fix him. So I think M1 is the one who's putting on the showtime, who's starting the lights, having the animatronics dance. And I think it's M1 doing this for 2 reasons. One, like I said, I think M1 is trying to stall the mimic in a way that would entertain M2, because M2 does seem to like to watch these animatronics perform. It's part of the reason why I think he doesn't interrupt the puppet show. That, or he just wasn't around. And 2, it's kind of like celebrating, right? It's kind of like I finally can fix my son with this tool. I just need Edwin to come over and do it. Let's throw a celebration. And I'm sure that this isn't. There's one thing that I want to be clear in. I'm almost certain that this is not for David. Right? The idea of M1 is putting on a show to entertain M2, who is now David. I don't think that's true. And the main reason I don't think it's true is we see what happens when the mimic becomes David again. He gets tiny, he gets those blue eyes, and all that. But then we see in that first ending, the mimic is, relatively regular sized and just watching onward, acting like the mimic has throughout the entire game. So I don't think that in that ending, M2 is David yet. I think M1 is trying to stall M2 until she can get somebody to use the data diver on the mimic to turn him back into David. Because I think it was the matter of we finally got the M2 blueprints and Fiona is realizing how difficult it will be without Edwin. Because the plan was Edwin will fix it. And then, who knows what happens after this ending, but at least during this ending, Fiona is trying to get a hold of Edwin while entertaining M2. I think that's what we're seeing in that first ending. So is that the canon ending? It could be. It could be the canon ending. The idea that M1 is trying to stall M2 as long as she can while waiting for somebody to fix M2. Now that M1 has a copy of those blueprints. It could be the canon ending. What other endings do we have in front of us? Well, the only other ending I haven't talked about is the second ending, or the normal quote-unquote good ending, the non-secret other ending, where we go down into the Pizzaplex, we go into the manor, we're following the instructions that Fiona is giving us, we find out Edwin is dead, we run Cradle, we burn down the whole facility, we escape. We don't quite escape, because the mimics kind of crash our car, and then M2 takes the data diver databank and walks away. So what's that about? What does that mean? This is where it gets tricky, because I think the crucial idea here is that Cradle.exe is involved, and Cradle.exe is the least explained part of this game. But it seems crucial to me. So At some point after M2 has started killing people, Fiona sends a message to Edwin to build something she calls Cradle.exe, which would involve a computer bigger than he's ever built, but it's something that could contain M2 and keep it away from people to save the people it's killing while Edwin works on a fix for M2. But, so, I think it's so clearly evident that Cradle.exe is a Mexis console. Right, I think it makes the most sense that a Mexis console, a big computer, something bigger than he's ever made, that is meant to house the Mimic, it seems like a Mexis console, seeing how Fiona is trapped inside of one. But if that's true, here's the problem. It's timeline. Because first of all, Fiona's already in a Mexis console. Now, I hear you, there could be two. Totally could be two Mexis consoles. But here's the real issue. If M2 is already being violent with people, that would imply that M2 is within the Mimic body, because it needs to be in a body to be violent with people. And if that's true, then I would assume that M1 is already in the Fiona console, because if M1 was in the endoskeleton, and eventually M2 is within it, M1 needs to go somewhere. So I assume M1 gets put into the Fiona console. But if that's the case, then this email doesn't make sense in the timeline, because M1 mentions it's bigger than anything you've ever made. But if Fiona's already in the Mexis console and Cradle.exe is the Mexis console, then it's already been made. Even if there's two Mexis consoles, it's bigger than anything you've made. It's about as big as the other thing you've made, right? So it's a weird issue. So I still don't know how I feel about it, but assuming that Cradle.exe is a program that contains M2 within the Mexis console, right? If that is what Cradle.exe is, which is what I think it is, then I think the second ending makes a lot more sense. So let's go through what's going on, right? Like, we're sent to go get Edwin, we find out he's dead, and then we go into his secret office, we run something called Cradle.exe, and we go down an elevator. And in that elevator, Fiona is talking to us, assuming we are Edwin. And, Fiona, who barely has any power left, is using the last of her power to reach out to Edwin. And is like, hey, please fix M2. Visit sometime, I'd love to see you. Please, please, please fix our child. I miss my child. And that's, M1 is directly begging Edwin to do this. And as we get to the bottom, so does the Mimic. Something that throws something aside to go chase us down. But here's the interesting thing. Every other ending that we directly encounter the Mimic, it kills us pretty immediately. Kills us in the first ending, it tries to kill us in the third ending, and throughout the entire game, if we get too close to the Mimic, it kills us directly. The only time the Mimic never kills us is this second ending, where if we get away, it crashes our car, and maybe Arnold's already dead, and maybe that's why we're not killed. Who knows? But the Mimic very, very intentionally lifts the van, grabs the data diver, and leaves us be. It just wants the data diver databank. So I have two possibilities of what this ending is saying, and I don't know which one I like more. There's one possibility that M2 is hearing all of this stuff that Fiona is saying, and this is when M2 learns that the data diver will reset it into David. If that's what's going on, right? Like, because we get the email where Fiona sends over like, hey, I'm sending somebody over to fix M2 to make it David again. We get that whole monologue in the elevator that maybe the Mimic heard as well. If that's the case, and now the Mimic knows that M1 is trying to turn it into David, once it catches up to us, priority number one is not kill Arnold anymore. Priority number one is, I am my own person. I don't want to be David. Let me take this data bank, the only existing copy of it left since the rest of the facility is burning to the ground, and destroy it, so there's no way you can manually reset me. That's possibility number one, and I don't mind that. I do like that. There's another possibility here, though. The idea that M2 Mimic we see at the very end isn't M2 anymore. And this has to do with what Cradle.exe might mean. Cradle.exe might be a way to contain a personality within the Mexis console, similar to how Fiona is inside of the Fiona Mexis console. And if that's true, we know that M1 was already in the Mimic endoskeleton at one point in the timeline. So what if Cradle.exe, something that Fiona created, what if that program not only puts M2 out of the Mimic endoskeleton and into a Mex's console where the personality can be kept safe until it's fixed, but it swaps it with M1. So M1 is able to re-enter the endoskeleton. This would go a long way to explain a few key weird points. First of all, like I've mentioned, this is the first time that the Mimic doesn't kill us, but instead goes after the data diver, something that M1 has been trying to get the entire game. But it also goes a pretty long way to explaining why the Mimic is so slow. Throughout the entire game, anytime the Mimic spots you, full sprint, as fast as hell. Just Olympian sprinting towards you. And I get that this is a chase sequence, so for the game they have to change it. But let's just go to the very end cutscene, right? Like, for the fact that this is a chase sequence in a video game, they have to make him a little slow so you can get away. And we see in this chase sequence, he's still pretty fast. He crawls on the ceiling like a motherfucker. So, like, you know, for a game, they have to make him slower. I get that. So, to take that excuse aside, let's go to the very end. The idea that the Mimic, what we see the Mimic do after the car crashes, he barely waddles over as if struggling to walk, takes the data diver, and continues to, like, limp away as if this is hard to do. I think these could be pointing to M1 having just swapped back into the Mimic endoskeleton. So then why? What's going on? Well, I wonder if activating Cradle.exe triggered something in M1's mind, like, oh, Edwin isn't just fixing the Mimic, what's going on? And then that's why the elevator monologue happens. Like, hey, Edwin, get back here, get back here, get back here. We keep going. You know, I don't know if M1 knows if it's Edwin or Arnold, but at this point, someone's leaving with that data diver. We need it. And at the same time, we activated Cradle.exe, which, if that swapped them, now M1 is in the Mimic endoskeleton, and the one thing M1 needs is leaving the building. Which maybe that explains why after the like ending sequence, why M1, now in the Mimic endoskeleton, approaches, takes the data diver, and leaves. M1 didn't want to kill Arnold. We see this in the first ending. Like, in the first ending, if we listen to M1 the entire time, M1 lets us leave. M1 is like, yeah, I moved your fan for you. Get out of here. You know? And sure, the Mimic kills us in that ending, but I think that's still M2 at that point. I genuinely think if we worked for M1 and fixed M2, M1 would not kill us. And I think we see that as well in the third ending. The idea that when we do fix M2 and turn him back into David, it just ends. I think arguing that it ends peacefully in a way that we can just walk away from. So if that's the case, and M1 isn't trying to kill Arnold, then it makes a lot of sense, if M1 is in the Mimic endoskeleton, that in this second ending, all the Mimic does is take the data diver and walk away. So that's where I'm stumped at, because I don't really know which one I like better. If it's M1 now in the Mimic endoskeleton, or if it's just M2 has learned M1 is trying to turn it into David, so now priorities have changed because it wants to stay its own person. I think... I didn't realize I would change the webcam that much. I think both are completely possible, and I don't know which one I like more. I'm sure you'll know which one I like more on Friday when I make the full video. But, so if that's the case, which ending is canon? Like, what ending connects it to the other games? I'm torn between 1 and 2. I think 3 is definitively the least possible. I don't really believe 3 is going to happen at all, but I'm torn between 1 and 2. I like 1 because it explains why the Mimic is still in the basement. Fiona was trying to keep it there until somebody could come by who could fix the Mimic, and nobody does by the time of Ruin. I think that's very possible. But I do also like the second ending, especially if Fiona and the Mimic have swapped. Because think about the ending of Ruin and how that functioned. The ending of Ruin, we encounter the Mex's console. Do we shut it off or do we activate a protocol? Let me double check this. Okay, so when you go to the console next to the Mex's console, when you go to like the monitor, it says security protocols are deactivated. Are you sure you wish to proceed? So looking at, you know, what the Mex's console is doing, if M2 and F1 have swapped and M1 is inside the Mimic endoskeleton and M2 is trapped inside the Mex's console, then I do wonder if when you activated that, you swapped them back. M1 is put back into the console, M2 is put back into the endoskeleton. I think that's super possible, right? Because then that explains why M1 was acting like why the mimic in Ruin was acting like M1. The idea of like pretending to be someone else over a radio to lure someone into doing what you want. This is something M1 has done very successfully as Dispatch and is doing again as Gregory. But then once that works and once we open it, suddenly it's M2 again. Now here's the question, right? Surely M1 realized in doing this, M1 would have been shunted back into the Mex's console, and M2 would have been put back into the endoskeleton. So is this, M1 giving up the fight and just wants her son to have a body again, even if he's violent? Maybe, Or there's some other grand plan. Maybe M1 wants to be back in the system to be able to better manipulate the things going around, whereas M2 is just kind of being violent within the system. That's possible as well. It's hard to tell. It's really hard to tell. But either way, I think that is the most likely option here. Because if it's if it's the first ending, then I question how we're trapping the mimic. I don't know. God, I'm really torn on which one of these endings makes the most sense to lead into Ruin. Because it's one of those things where we clearly have a massive gap between then and now. That we have to, there's something in there that we need to figure out. And then something else I should address. A lot of people have been wondering, is M1 glitch trap? I think it's possible. I think the most likely answer here is that the old tech that was scanned into the Help Wanted system to make glitch trap and make everything function better is the data diver, which has the original mimic blueprints on it, which the original mimic blueprints, like M1, it just replicates a personality that it has information on. So it does that with William Afton. I think that's what we're seeing in glitch trap, and it's being colored by what's already there with the fact that Edwin made it, but I think that's what we're seeing, where it's like, well, Edwin made felt suits, and we are replicating William, and William was wearing this yellow rabbit, so let me make a felt yellow rabbit. And bada bing, bada boom, glitch trap is created. That being said, if that's the case, how did Fazbear get the data diver if all three endings, like the only ending that Fazbear could easily get the data diver is the third ending, which I really don't think is the canon one. It could be. I really don't think so. So maybe that's an idea of like Fiona meets up with William, or like William discovers Fiona more accurately, and maybe receives the data diver. It's hard to tell. I think though, where I'm currently leaning is that ending 2 is the canon one, and that M2 and M1 are swapped when you run cradle.exe, and Cassie unswaps it in Ruin. I think that makes the most sense. I think that's where I'm at. Maybe. Either that or or the ending 2 is the most canon one, and M2 got the data diver and goes to destroy it or hide it somewhere, so he'll never be made to be David again. And part of that is the whole, I think it was Spencer Singer or MLG Spence pointed out that in the Ruin mimic model, there is like a ripped out thing in the chest, like there's wires that are ripped and nothing there, where in the Secret of the Mimic model, that's where the box we interface with to upload M2's original blueprints are. So like ripping that out is kind of an act of defiance. The idea of like, you will not change what I've become. You cannot make me something into that I have not made myself. So if that's true, then maybe M2 was in there all along and he just took the data diver to go destroy it because that was the new priority. If so, how do we end up back in Ruin? Who's to say? Something we'll have to figure out. I meant to make this episode, how does this game connect to the other games? And I kind of just talked about the endings for like 30 minutes. But this game's dense. All right, I tried. But we'll do some questions because I think we're only approaching 40 minutes. We got plenty of time. If you want your questions answered on the podcast, feel free to send them into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast @gmail.com. That's in the description to copy and paste because it's paid to type out. Our first question comes from Autumn Graves, she, they. Moon.exe tells us that Sun is meant to be Fiona, and Moon is Edwin. And the story of Secret of the Mimic lets us know that Mimic 1 is Fiona, and Mimic 2 is Edwin. Not quite. We also know Sun and Moon have two different personalities. Is it plausible that at some point M1 and M2 may have merged into Sun and Moon? Hope that makes sense. Okay, so I disagree with the things you have set up as facts here. Moon.exe is telling us Sun is Fiona, Moon is Edwin. Yes. The story of Secret of the Mimic lets us know that M1 is Fiona and M2 is Edwin. No. M2, I think from the evidence in front of us, is a conglomeration. Like I've been saying, it's almost its own character at that point. The idea that it's part Edwin, it's part David, it's part the other characters, it's part Fiona. It is this like weird conglomeration of everything it has known. Kind of like any other human being at that point. This whole Secret of the Mimic story is very Detroit Become Human. It's very much like, if I am a robot who's meant to replicate my environment, and I have created myself as an amalgamation of everyone I've ever known, how is that any different than a human? Right? Like, that is kind of the question that's being asked here, is like, as a mimic, as M2, right? If I'm M2, I have observed my environment and taken in that information, and I am a conglomeration of my environment. I am a product of my environment. If I'm a human being, likewise, all I know is the things I have seen, and all I am is a conglomeration of the things I have known. So I think that is the question this game is asking us, is like, is M2 just approaching being a human, a new human? So I don't think M2 is Edwin, just like I don't think M2 is David. I think M2 is its own person. However, the question of did M1 and M2 merge into Sun and Moon? I think it's such an interesting concept, because in moon.exe, we build the moon like body, and then, Mr. Helper talks to us and says, you are sun and moon, you are creation and destruction. So it's like, okay, is this saying that M2 becomes sun moon? I don't think it's that literal, because likewise, moon.exe doesn't happen in real life, right? It's this fantastical, perfect version of it. I tend to like my interpretation that this is Fiona imagining what M2 could be, and that would be half of herself, Sun, and half of her husband, Edwin, or Moon, right? So the idea that their child would be half Fiona and half Edwin makes, that's like a robotic understanding of how genealogical traditions work, right? So I see it as moon.exe telling us that Fiona wants M2 to be her child. That's my take on it. But thank you for your question. Our next one comes from Cray, they, he. I'm not sure how well versed you are in real-life animatronic history. Not at all. But Secret of the Mimic seems to include a lot of parallels to IRL companies, mainly CEI, creative engineering, from the giant warehouse full of workshops and projects to the predatory contract designed by a pizza chain to acquire the company, and many smaller things. I was a part of the Chuck E. Cheese/Showbiz Pizza fandom before FNAF, so these parallels may be more noticeable to me, but I was wondering if you think that Steel Wool takes not only design inspiration from them, but also story-wise, and if we should even be using it in theory crafting. Thank you for your question, Craig. I think this is very much in the same school of thought as a lot of game theory episodes and some of my theories as well, that and a lot of people do this, I think ID's Fantasy has done this at some points. I do this a lot. Like I said, game theory does this a lot. It's the idea of using real life, facts and history as not necessarily evidence, but framing for a theory. And I think that's perfectly valid. So your question is is Steel Wool taking inspiration from these stories, and should we be using it in theory crafting? Frankly, even if Steel Wool is or isn't taking inspiration from real life showbiz history, I don't think it matters. I don't think it matters if Steel Wool is literally looking at the history of these franchises and going we can take inspiration from that. Because I think having that real life parallel is useful regardless. To kind of show you how things similar to it have functioned in the real world, that's not to say that this would prove a theory, but I think it is useful to bring up in theory crafting as excellent supporting evidence. I would never say build a whole theory based solely off of the Showbiz Pizza history. But I think if you already have a theory that's going down that way and you have evidence in-game to support it, a great framing device and supporting evidence to use is that real-world history. Or like if you're already talking about these predatory contracts and like, oh, you know, William and Henry were trying to absorb Murray's costume manor so they wouldn't have to pay. And this is something that happens in the real world too. Evidence, you know? It's not something that proves your theory, but I think it does strengthen it. I did something similar when I was talking about Glamrock Foxy's absence in Security Breach. I used sheets and their and how they handled alcohol as supporting evidence for Glamrock Foxy being something that was planned to be added but never was. And I kind of talked about how, like, you know, there's all this merchandise of Glamrock Foxy, and there's even some more that's tucked away. This was before Ruin, but I don't think Glamrock Foxy was ever there. So then I was like, well, then how do you explain why there's so much Glamrock Foxy merchandise, or like Foxy merchandise about the Pizzaplex? And then I talked about how in Pennsylvania, there was a law that convenience stores and anywhere that sold gasoline could not sell alcohol. And Sheetz is a convenience store that often sells gas. And they knew this was a law, but like many companies, they knew this was an old law that was going to be overturned eventually. So every Sheetz built what they called the soda cave, which was a massive walk-in refrigerator that just held soda. And it was incredibly weird and incredibly redundant because they already sold soda everywhere else in the store. There was just this additional extra walk-in fridge just for soda, which was so weird. But then, the moment that law was overturned, almost overnight, every Sheetz's soda cave became their beer cave, and it was a walk-in place to buy beer at the convenience store. And that's why it was a separate area, and that's why it was a refrigerated, like walk-in refrigerator, specifically to be selling alcohol, something they couldn't have done earlier, but they were laying the groundwork so they knew that when they could flip it over immediately. And I use that to say that, like, does this prove the theory on Security Breach? No, but the idea of a business testing the waters and building out something so that once it gets approved, they can quickly turn it around is something that happens a lot. And that's good supporting evidence for what I think they were trying to do with Foxy before everything started going wrong. So, again, to wrap back to your question, should you be using real-life history for theory crafting? Yeah, as supporting evidence. I wouldn't use it as your main point of evidence, but it's really helpful to flesh out and frame a theory and help you give yourself a guiding principle. So yeah, that would be my evidence, and that would be my advice, and thank you for your question. But I believe we're past 45 minutes at this point, so if you want your questions sent on the podcast, don't forget to send them into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. That's in the description, copy and paste, because it's a pain to type out. But until next time, as always, thank you for watching the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast, where the pizza abilities are endless. We hope to enjoy your future patronage. Bye-bye for now.